Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. On the line with me, I've got Catherine Burns. Hi, Catherine. How are you doing?
Hello, Stephen. Lovely to see you.
Yes, likewise. And thank you for joining us again. I really enjoyed our session last week where we discussed the different historical periods and van Rensburg text in particular, and how van Rensburg was setting up his argument, and just thinking about that a little bit. And I'm sure the students are aware of it now because we've started reading the van Rensburg text this week, and we started with chapter 2. And the first part of the van Rensburg text, he describes the Dutch colonial moment, the period where the Dutch arrived Jan van Riebeck and set up the Cape Colony. And that brings me to my first question, which is about the health system at the point in time when the Dutch arrived and how that might have changed and evolved with the influence of the Dutch. So what would you say best describes the predominant form of medical care or the health system in the expanded colony in the 1650s to the 1790s era?
Yes, Stephen, van Rensburg does a jolly good job of setting out the periodization in a simple and easy to understand way for the students. And, his citations and references are good. So I don't want to give anybody the impression that I am dismissing him as a source. But he very much begins or opens or inaugurates the period with the arrival of van Riebeck. And I just wanted to take the students back a little before that to allow them, and I'm sure many of them are thinking about this as they read it, to think about the period just before the arrival of those Dutch merchants with the interests of the Royal House of the Netherlands and their interest in creating at the Cape a refreshment station. Before the Dutch arrive, there's already a quite loose, not highly regulated or centralized, and very community-specific form of health practice across the Western Cape. The sources that we have begin in about the 1500s. They don't go back much before then, unless we look at cave paintings or some archaeological or agricultural evidence, for example, the cultivation of certain crops. But what we can discern and what historians have drawn together is a series of accounts in which we see that Khoisan and other indigenous people were using a range of what we would call herbal apothecary practices, local knowledge of healing medications from plants. But they also had a sophisticated system of massage therapy for particular kinds of injuries, phlebotomy, which the students will already have read about in other texts, cupping, early forms of inoculation, and cultural phenomena around healing that included trances, meditation, dream analysis, and what people might call art therapy today. So these practices were already in existence. And when the Dutch arrived, they brought with them, as the students will read, medications and therapeutic treatments and preventative treatments from the Netherlands, but they also quickly interacted with local healers and experts, and they began to develop a kind of overlapping system of medical knowledge. And these two sort of work in tandem. Some of it is planned, and you actually have people on Van Riebeck's staff, Van Riebeck himself, and people that come after Van Riebeck from the Netherlands, who try to actually systematize some of this knowledge and create botanic gardens where they draw on indigenous Khoisan knowledge, and they create the very, very early form of what we now call the Kirstenbosch gardens at the Cape, which of course are now an internationally protected form of floral kingdom. They also begin to develop local versions of Dutch medications, and they begin to share and they begin to interrogate indigenous knowledge producers. They also begin to create a kind of more systematic Dutch form of health control, a form of public health around their view of contagion. And they developed this knowledge based on their mercantile experience in the Netherlands and in other parts of the world that they'd explored, and in their reading of Spanish and Portuguese and British and German and Chinese texts. And for example, particularly in the harbor of Cape Town, they begin to set up a set of regulations where the harbor master and where the authorities concerned can decide whether or not they want to actually quarantine a ship or divide one group of people suffering from a particular disorder from another. So that method of quarantining and of dividing people around sanitary requirements and around fears of epidemics has some elements in it that we still have in modern medicine today. And some elements are what we have rejected based on scientific evidence of a more recent sort, such as deciding whether or not there are miasmas or certain kinds of bodies or people that are more likely or less likely to carry diseases between one another. So these different forms begin to overlap. And by the time we get to the late 1700s, when the Dutch presence has extended right into the hinterlands or the surrounding areas, we've got these different systems operating, some with more power behind them, with more military force behind them that are more systematic, and some that are more open-ended, that are more plural, and that are more integrative.